The dust hadn't settled for weeks. Thomas Peterson wiped his brow with a handkerchief that had long since turned from white to a muddy brown. The relentless Texas summer had baked the earth to a cracked crust, and what little vegetation remained on his newly acquired property drooped in surrender to the heat. "It's not much," he said to his wife, Margaret, as their wagon creaked to a halt in front of the two-story farmhouse. "But it's ours." Margaret clutched their infant daughter Eleanor to her chest, eyeing the weathered structure with apprehension. The house stood alone on the flat expanse of land, its wooden frame grey and tired against the harsh landscape. The nearest neighbour was 3 miles east, and the town of Amarillo lay 15 miles to the south. "It has good bones," Margaret offered, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Thomas smiled, grateful for her attempt at optimism. They had risked everything on this move west from Pennsylvania after his father's death left them a modest inheritance. The money had been just enough to purchase this remote property at a surprisingly affordable price. "I'll start unloading," he said, jumping down from the wagon. "You and Ellie go inside and rest." Margaret carried their daughter up the creaking porch steps. The door groaned on its hinges as she pushed it open, releasing the stale air that had been trapped inside for months. The previous owners had left abruptly, according to the land agent in Amarillo, though he had been suspiciously vague about the reasons. The interior was sparse, but not uninhabitable. A wooden table with 4 chairs occupied the center of what would be their kitchen and living area. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, and a narrow staircase led to the second floor, where she assumed the bedrooms would be. As she stood in the doorway, Eleanor began to fuss. "Shh, my darling," Margaret whispered, bouncing the baby gently. "This is our home now." That night, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Margaret settled Eleanor into a makeshift crib in the smaller of the 2 upstairs bedrooms. Thomas lit oil lamps throughout the house, casting long shadows on the walls as darkness fell. "The land agent mentioned there's a well out back," Thomas said, as they prepared for bed. "Tomorrow I'll check its condition and see about planting some vegetables before winter comes." Margaret nodded, her mind elsewhere. Since entering the house, she had felt a persistent unease, as if they were not alone. She dismissed it as fatigue from the long journey and the stress of starting anew. They retired to the master bedroom, the larger of the 2 upstairs rooms. The wooden bed frame creaked under their weight, but the mattress they'd brought from Pennsylvania provided some comfort. Thomas fell asleep almost instantly, his breathing deep and regular. Margaret lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their new home, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through cracks in the walls, the distant howl of a coyote. It was just after midnight when she heard it. A soft knocking, 3 distinct taps on their bedroom door. She froze, straining to hear over her husband's breathing. Perhaps she had imagined it. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. "Thomas," she whispered, shaking her husband's shoulder. He stirred, mumbling incoherently. "Thomas, someone's at the door." He sat up, instantly alert. "Eleanor?" "No, someone's knocking at our door." They both stared at the closed bedroom door as the knocking came again, more insistent this time. Thomas reached for the shotgun he'd propped against the wall and moved toward the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear Margaret could see in his eyes. No response came, only another series of knocks. Thomas threw open the door, raising the shotgun. The hallway was empty. Thomas stepped into the hallway, peering into the darkness. "Must have been the wind," he said, though they both knew the air that night was still as death. Margaret checked on Eleanor, finding the baby sleeping peacefully, unaware of the disturbance. When she returned to bed, Thomas was already settling back under the covers, fatigue overcoming his concern. "Old houses make strange noises," he assured her. "We'll get used to it." But Margaret lay awake until dawn, listening for the knocking that didn't come again that night. The next day, Thomas explored their property, examining the well as planned and walking the boundaries of their land. Margaret busied herself with unpacking and arranging their meager belongings, trying to make the house feel more like home. "The soil's not great, but it'll do," Thomas reported when he returned for lunch. "And the well needs cleaning, but there's water. We can make this work, Maggie." She smiled at his enthusiasm, though the knocking from the previous night still troubled her. "Did the land agent mention anything else about the previous owners? Why they left so suddenly?" Thomas shrugged. "Just that they moved back east. Family matters, I think he said." That evening, as darkness fell once more, Margaret felt the same sense of unease creeping over her. She tucked Eleanor in, singing softly until the child's eyes grew heavy. "Sleep tight, my angel," she whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead before retreating to her own bedroom. Thomas was already in bed, his day's labor having exhausted him. Margaret joined him, listening to the house settling around them. She had almost convinced herself that the previous night's knocking had been her imagination when it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Thomas bolted upright beside her. "You hear that?" Margaret nodded, her throat too tight with fear to speak. Tap, 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 more insistent now, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side of the door was growing impatient. Thomas grabbed his shotgun and approached the door. "Who's there?" he demanded. "I'm armed." The knocking stopped abruptly. Thomas waited a moment, then yanked the door open as he had the night before. Again, the hallway was empty. "This is ridiculous," Thomas muttered, stalking down the hall to check Eleanor's room, and then descending the stairs to ensure all doors and windows were secured. When he returned, his face was pale. "Everything's locked tight. There's no one in the house but us." The knocking didn't return that night, but neither of them slept well. In the morning, Thomas rode into Amarillo for supplies, leaving Margaret alone with Eleanor. As she went about her chores, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Occasionally, she would catch movement from the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing there. In town, Thomas encountered Mr. Jenkins, the general store owner, who recognized him as a newcomer. "Peterson, is it?" Jenkins asked as he packed Thomas's supplies. "You're the one who bought the old Wilkins place?" Thomas nodded. "That's right. Do you know anything about the previous owners?" Jenkins' hands stilled momentarily. "The Wilkins family? They weren't there long, maybe 8 months. And before them, the Carter family owned it for about a year. And before them, the Dawsons." Jenkins hesitated. "None of them stayed very long." Thomas frowned. "Is there something wrong with the property?" Jenkins avoided his gaze. "Not for me to say. Some folks are just restless, I suppose." When Thomas pressed further, Jenkins changed the subject, asking about crops and livestock. As Thomas rode home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. He urged his horse to a faster pace, suddenly anxious to return to Margaret and Eleanor. Thomas found Margaret sitting rigid at the kitchen table, Eleanor sleeping in her arms. "What happened?" he asked, setting down his purchases. "I heard children laughing," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Upstairs in Eleanor's room, but when I went to look there was no one there." Thomas felt a chill, despite the warmth of the evening. "You've been alone all day. Your mind is playing tricks." "I know what I heard, Thomas." Her voice was firm despite her obvious fear. "And last night wasn't the wind. Something was knocking at our door." That night they put Eleanor to bed together, then retired to their room earlier than usual. Thomas had brought back a bottle of whiskey from town, and he poured them each a small glass. "For the nerves," he said with a forced smile. They sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of the house and the night outside. The whiskey warmed Margaret's throat, but did little to calm her racing mind. "Tell me what Jenkins said," she urged. Thomas sighed. "Not much. Just that the last few families didn't stay long." "Did he say why?" "No, but he seemed uncomfortable when I asked." They fell silent as darkness enveloped the house completely. The oil lamp on the bedside table cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the room seem to shift and move. "Maybe we should go back to Pennsylvania," Margaret suggested quietly. Thomas shook his head. "We've put everything into this place. We can't just abandon it because of a few strange noises." Margaret wanted to argue further, but she knew he was right. They had nowhere else to go, no money for another fresh start. They eventually lay down, though neither expected to sleep. Thomas kept his shotgun close, and Margaret stared at the door, waiting. The knocking came just after midnight, as it had the 2 previous nights. 3 soft taps, followed by silence, then 3 more. This time they heard something else, a child's laughter, faint but unmistakable, on the other side of the door. Thomas grabbed his shotgun and moved toward the door, while Margaret clutched the bedsheets, her knuckles white with fear. "Who's there?" Thomas demanded. The laughter came again, followed by whispers too faint to make out. Thomas threw open the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different, colder somehow, and heavy with an invisible presence. "Show yourself!" Thomas shouted, his voice echoing through the house. In response, Eleanor began to cry from her room. Margaret rushed past Thomas to check on their daughter, finding her standing in her crib, tears streaming down her face. "It's all right, sweetheart," Margaret soothed, lifting Eleanor into her arms. "Mama's here." As she comforted the child, Margaret noticed something on the wooden floor, small, dusty footprints, too big to be Eleanor's, but too small to belong to an adult. They led from the doorway to the crib and back again, as if someone had approached the baby, and then retreated. "Thomas," she called, her voice trembling. "Come look at this." He appeared in the doorway, shotgun still in hand, and followed her gaze to the floor. His face paled at the sight of the footprints. "Those weren't there when we put her to bed," Margaret whispered. Thomas knelt to examine them more closely. They looked like children's footprints. A cold draft swept through the room, causing the single oil lamp to flicker. In that moment of near darkness, they both heard it again, children's laughter, now seeming to come from every corner of the house at once. Eleanor whimpered and buried her face in her mother's neck, as if she too could sense the unseen presence. "We're not staying here tonight," Thomas decided, his earlier stubbornness giving way to genuine fear. "Get what you need for Eleanor. We'll sleep in the wagon." They spent that night under the stars, huddled together in the back of their wagon. Despite the discomfort, it was preferable to the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Neither of them spoke of what they had experienced, as if putting it into words would make it more real. The next morning, Thomas rode back into Amarillo, determined to get answers. This time, he bypassed the general store and headed straight for the land agent's office. Mr. Grimsby, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up from his desk with surprise when Thomas burst in. "Mr. Peterson, what can I do for you?" "You can tell me why you sold me a haunted house," Thomas demanded, his hands planted firmly on Grimsby's desk. Grimsby's face remained impassive. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. 3 nights we've been there, and 3 nights we've heard knocking at our bedroom door, children's laughter in empty rooms, footprints appearing out of nowhere." Thomas leaned closer. "What happened in that house?" Grimsby sighed and removed his spectacles, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Please sit down, Mr. Peterson." Thomas reluctantly took the offered chair, his anger temporarily subdued by the agent's change in demeanor. "I am required by law to disclose any known structural defects in a property," Grimsby began carefully. "The spiritual history of a house, however, falls outside those requirements." "So you admit there is something wrong with the place?" Grimsby replaced his spectacles. "I admit nothing, but since you're asking directly, I can tell you what I've heard." He lowered his voice. "Before your purchase, the property had changed hands 4 times in 5 years. Each family left abruptly, though none would specify why." "And before that?" Thomas pressed. Grimsby hesitated. "The original owner was a man named Elijah Blackwood. He built the house in 1887 for his family, a wife and 3 children. In the winter of 1890, while Blackwood was away on business in Dallas, there was a tragedy." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "What kind of tragedy?" "A fever swept through the area. Mrs. Blackwood and all 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, succumbed within days of each other. Blackwood returned to find his entire family dead. Grimsby's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. They say he went mad with grief, locked himself in the house with their bodies for a week before the sheriff broke down the door and found him. Found him how? Hanging from the rafters in the master bedroom. Your bedroom, Mr. Peterson. Thomas felt sick. Why didn't you tell me this before I bought the property? Would you have still purchased it if I had? When Thomas remained silent, Grimsby nodded. Precisely. Besides, it's just local superstition. There's no proof that— No proof, Thomas interrupted, his voice rising. My wife and I have heard children knocking at our door for 3 nights. We've heard their laughter. We've seen their footprints. Grimsby's expression betrayed a flicker of genuine concern. Mr. Peterson, I'm sorry for your distress, but the sale is final. The property is yours, ghosts and all. Thomas left the office with a heavy heart, knowing that Margaret would be devastated by what he had learned. As he mounted his horse for the ride home, he noticed an elderly woman watching him from across the street. After a moment's hesitation, she approached him. You're the new owner of the Blackwood house, she said. It wasn't a question. How did you know? I recognize that look, she replied. I nursed Sarah Blackwood and her children during that terrible fever. I was the only one who would go near the house. Everyone else was afraid of getting sick. Thomas dismounted, suddenly eager to hear what this woman had to say. Please, tell me about the children. There were 3 of them. William was 8, James was 6, and little Mary was just 4. The old woman's eyes grew distant with memory. They were sweet children, even in their illness. Always polite, always knocking before entering their mother's room to check on her. Thomas felt a chill at her words. Knocking? The woman nodded. 3 times. Always 3 times. It was a game their mother had taught them. Always announce yourself properly, she would say. Thomas returned home to find Margaret pacing on the porch, Eleanor in her arms. The relief on her face at seeing him quickly turned to concern as she read his expression. What did you learn? She asked as he dismounted. Thomas couldn't bring himself to relay the entire conversation with Grimsby and the old nurse, not yet. Let's get inside first, he said, glancing at the setting sun. We need to prepare for the night. Once inside, they secured all doors and windows. Thomas built a fire in the stove, despite the warm evening, hoping its light and warmth might keep whatever haunted their home at bay. As Margaret prepared a simple dinner, Thomas finally shared what he had discovered in town. Children, Margaret whispered when he finished. 3 children who died in this very house, and their mother, and the father who couldn't live without them, Thomas added grimly. Margaret clutched Eleanor tighter. We have to leave, Thomas. We can't stay here. We have nowhere else to go, Maggie. Everything we have is invested in this place. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. But I won't put you and Eleanor in danger. If it happens again tonight, we'll figure something out. As darkness fell, they moved all their bedding downstairs, creating a makeshift bed in the kitchen near the warm stove. Thomas kept his shotgun within reach, though he now understood it would be useless against their unseen visitors. The nurse said they were good children, Margaret said, as they lay in the dim light of the stove's embers. If they're still here, perhaps they're not trying to harm us. Then what do they want? Thomas wondered aloud. Eleanor had fallen asleep between them, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Maybe they're just lonely, Margaret suggested, or confused. They died so young, in this very house. They fell into an uneasy silence, both listening for the now familiar knocking. Midnight came and went without incident, and Thomas began to hope that perhaps the presence of their family in the kitchen, rather than the upstairs bedrooms, had disrupted whatever pattern the spirits followed. It was just after 1 o'clock when they heard it, not from upstairs, but from the back door of the kitchen. Tap, tap, tap. Thomas and Margaret exchanged alarmed glances. The knocking came again, followed by the sound they had come to dread most, children's laughter, soft but distinct, just outside the door. What do we do? Margaret whispered. Thomas took a deep breath, making a decision that went against every instinct he had. I think we should answer it." "Thomas, no. They've been knocking for 3 nights, Maggie. Maybe they just want to be acknowledged." Before Margaret could protest further, Thomas stood and moved toward the back door. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the latch. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steadier than he felt. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, a child's voice, faint but clear. "May we come in, please?" Margaret gasped behind him, instinctively pulling Eleanor closer. Thomas hesitated, then called out again, "Why do you want to come in?" "We live here," came the simple reply. "This is our home." Thomas looked back at Margaret, who shook her head vigorously, but something about the plaintive quality of the child's voice moved him. These were children who had died tragically, whose lives had been cut short in this very house. If they were still here, trapped somehow between worlds, didn't they deserve some compassion? "You may come in," Thomas said finally, "but you must not harm my wife or daughter." He unlatched the door and slowly pulled it open. The night air rushed in, cool and sweet, but there was no one visible on the other side. Yet Thomas felt them enter, a subtle shift in the air, a whisper of movement, a drop in temperature. Margaret must have felt it too, for she clutched Eleanor protectively and whispered a prayer. "Thank you," came the voice again, now inside the kitchen. "It's been so long since anyone would let us in." Thomas remained by the open door, uncertain what to do next. He could sense the invisible presence of the children in the room, though he could not see them. "Close the door," Margaret whispered, fear evident in her voice. "You've invited them in. Now close the door." Thomas complied, securing the latch once more. The kitchen felt crowded now, despite no visible addition to their family of 3. "Where are you?" Thomas asked the empty air. "Why can't we see you?" A giggle came from near the stove, and the fire's embers briefly flared higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "We're right here," said the voice they had heard at the door. A boy's voice, Thomas thought, perhaps the oldest of the Blackwood children. "You can't see us because we're not like you anymore." "Are you ghosts?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Another laugh, this one from a different child, younger, more high-pitched. "Is that what we are? We don't know what we are. We just know we can't leave." Thomas moved to sit beside Margaret and Eleanor on their makeshift bed. "The nurse in town told me your names. You're William, James, and Mary Blackwood, aren't you?" A sudden chill swept through the room, and the fire dimmed momentarily. "She remembered us?" This voice was small and distinctly feminine. Mary, the youngest, Thomas guessed. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "She spoke fondly of you. She said you were good children, always polite, always knocking before entering a room." "Mother taught us manners," said the first voice, William's. "Always knock 3 times and wait to be invited in." Is your mother here too?" Margaret asked, her fear gradually giving way to curiosity. There was a pause, then William's voice again, tinged with sadness. "Sometimes. She comes and goes. We stay." "And your father?" Thomas ventured. The temperature in the room dropped sharply at this question. Eleanor stirred in her sleep, whimpering at the sudden cold. "Father is in the dark place," said James, the middle child. "He did a bad thing. He can't come here anymore." Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances, both thinking of Grimsby's account of Elijah Blackwood's suicide. "Why do you stay?" Margaret asked gently. "Wouldn't you rather be at peace?" "We are waiting," Mary's small voice replied. "Waiting for what?" Thomas pressed. "For someone to play with us," said William. "It's lonely here." Margaret clutched Eleanor tighter instinctively, a mother's protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by the unseen children. "Your baby is pretty," Mary said, her voice suddenly very close to Margaret. "What's her name?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "Eleanor. She's named after my grandmother." "Eleanor," Mary repeated, as if testing the name. "Can I play with her when she's bigger?" The innocent question sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. "She's too little to play now," she replied carefully. "She needs her mother." "We needed our mother too," said James, "but the fever took her away." "Do." The sadness in the child's voice was palpable, filling the kitchen with a melancholy that made Thomas's chest ache. These weren't malevolent spirits, he realized, just confused and lonely children, trapped in the place where they had died, unable to move on. "What if we played with you?" Thomas suggested suddenly. Would that help? The air in the kitchen seemed to lighten, and Thomas thought he could almost see the faint outlines of 3 small figures near the stove. "Would you?" William asked, hope evident in his voice. "No one has played with us since we got sick." "What games do you like to play?" Margaret asked, warming to Thomas's idea despite her lingering fear. "Hide and seek!" Mary exclaimed. "But we're very good at hiding now." A ghostly laugh followed this statement, echoed by her brothers. "I'm sure you are," Thomas said with a small smile. "But perhaps we could start with something simpler. Do you know any singing games?" "Mother taught us Ring Around the Rosie," James offered. Margaret and Thomas exchanged a glance at the ironic choice. A children's game believed by many to have originated during a plague. Still, if it would bring some comfort to these lost souls. "We could sing that," Margaret agreed. And so, in the dim light of the kitchen, an unusual scene unfolded. Thomas and Margaret sitting on their makeshift bed, singing a children's rhyme with 3 invisible playmates, while baby Eleanor slept peacefully between them. As dawn approached, the presence of the children seemed to fade. Their voices grew fainter, their laughter more distant, until Thomas and Margaret found themselves alone once more in the kitchen, Eleanor still sleeping soundly. "Are they gone?" Margaret whispered. Thomas nodded. "I think they can only manifest strongly at night. During the day they're just echoes." They had spent hours with the Blackwood children, singing songs, telling stories, and listening to the ghostly trio recount memories of their short lives. The experience had been surreal, but not frightening. Rather, it had filled them both with a profound sadness for these young lives cut short. "They're just children," Margaret said, voicing Thomas's own thoughts. "Lonely, confused children who don't understand that they've died." "Or they understand but can't move on," Thomas suggested. "They said they were waiting for someone to play with them." Margaret looked down at Eleanor, still blissfully unaware of the night's extraordinary events. They seemed drawn to her, especially the little girl, Mary. "She's close to the age Mary was when she died," Thomas reasoned. "Perhaps she senses a kindred spirit." As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, they discussed what to do. Leaving was still financially impossible, yet the prospect of sharing their home with 3 ghost children was daunting, despite the relatively peaceful interaction of the previous night. "We could try to help them move on," Margaret suggested. "Find out what's keeping them here." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The old nurse might know more. I should speak with her again." They moved through the day in a haze of exhaustion, taking turns napping while the other tended to Eleanor and the necessary chores. The house felt different now, not exactly welcoming but less oppressive. Knowing the source of the disturbances had somehow made them less frightening. In the afternoon, Thomas rode back to Amarillo, seeking out the elderly nurse he had spoken with before. He found her sitting on the porch of a small house on the outskirts of town. "I thought you might return," she said as he approached. "You've met them, haven't you?" Thomas nodded, dismounting and taking a seat beside her on the porch steps. "We spoke with them last night. They said they're waiting for someone to play with them." The old woman nodded sadly. "Those poor children. Their passing was hard, Mr. Peterson. The fever took them quickly, but not painlessly. Their mother watched each of them slip away while she herself was dying. They said their father is in the dark place," Thomas mentioned, "because he did a bad thing. Suicide is considered a sin," the nurse explained. "In their innocent understanding, they believe their father is being punished while they wait in a kind of limbo." "Is there any way to help them?" Thomas asked. "To help them move on?" The old woman was silent for a long moment. "There are stories," she finally said, "about spirits who remain because of unfinished business. The Blackwood children were buried hastily during the epidemic. There was no proper funeral, no chance for the community to mourn them, or for their father to say goodbye before his own tragic end. So they feel incomplete, Thomas surmised. Perhaps, the nurse agreed. Or perhaps they simply don't know how to leave. They were so young. What can we do? The nurse reached out a gnarled hand and patted Thomas's arm. Show them kindness, Mr. Peterson. Acknowledge them. Remember them. Sometimes that's all the departed need. When Thomas returned home, he shared the nurse's insights with Margaret. Together, they formulated a plan. That night, as darkness fell, they once again waited in the kitchen. This time, they had prepared. Margaret had baked cookies, the kind she imagined children would enjoy, and Thomas had found a few simple toys in town, a wooden top, a ball, and a small rag doll. They didn't have to wait long. Just after sunset, the familiar knocking came at the back door. Tap, tap, tap. "Come in," Thomas called. The door remained closed, but they felt the children enter, bringing with them the now familiar chill. "You're still here," William's voice said, sounding pleased and surprised. "We told you we would play with you," Margaret replied gently, "and I've made cookies." A delighted gasp came from where Mary's voice usually originated. "Real cookies? Can we eat them?" Margaret placed the plate on the table. "I don't know, dear, can you?" There was a moment of silence, then a giggle from James. "We can try." To Thomas and Margaret's amazement, one of the cookies seemed to lift slightly from the plate, hovering in the air for a moment before a small bite disappeared from its edge. "It doesn't taste like anything," Mary said, disappointment evident in her voice. "But I remember what cookies taste like." "We brought some toys, too," Thomas said, placing the simple gifts on the table beside the cookies. The children's excitement was palpable. Though Thomas and Margaret could not see them clearly, they occasionally caught glimpses, a shimmer in the air, a vague outline, a brief impression of a small face or hand reaching for the toys. They played together for hours, the living and the dead united in simple games. Margaret sang lullabies she remembered from her own childhood, and the ghostly children joined in when they recognized a tune. As the night deepened, Thomas decided it was time to broach the subject they had discussed earlier. "William, James, Mary," he said, addressing the empty air where he sensed the children to be. "We've been thinking about what you said, about waiting here." "We have to wait," William replied, his voice suddenly solemn. "We can't leave." "Why not?" Margaret asked gently. There was a long pause before Mary's small voice answered, "Because no one said goodbye." Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance, the nurse's words echoing in their minds about the hasty burials and lack of proper mourning. "Would you like us to say goodbye?" Thomas offered. "Would that help?" Another pause, longer this time. "We don't know," James finally admitted. "Where are you buried?" Margaret asked. "Do you know?" "In the cemetery in town," William answered, "under the big oak tree. Father showed us once when Grandfather died. He said that's where all the Blackwoods would rest someday." Thomas nodded, making a mental note to visit the cemetery the next day. "We could go there," he suggested. "We could say proper goodbyes, have a small service for you." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the flames in the stove flickered violently. "No!" Mary cried, her voice distressed. "Don't make us go away. We want to stay and play with Eleanor when she's bigger." "Mary," Margaret said softly, "Eleanor will grow up. She'll change. You won't. Don't you want to be at peace? To be with your mother?" "Mother comes sometimes," William said, his voice thoughtful. "She says we should go to the light, but we're scared." "What are you scared of?" Thomas asked. "The dark place," James whispered, "where Father went." Thomas's heart ached at the fear in the child's voice. "You won't go to the dark place," he assured them. "You were children, innocent. You'll go somewhere beautiful, somewhere peaceful." "How do you know?" William challenged. "Faith," Margaret answered simply. "And because you deserve peace after all this time." The conversation continued well into the night, the living family trying to convince the ghostly children that moving on was for the best. By the time the first hint of dawn appeared on the horizon, no resolution had been reached, but a seed had been planted in the children's minds. The next day, Thomas visited the Amarillo cemetery and found the Blackwood family plot beneath a sprawling oak tree, just as William had described. 4 simple markers stood in a row: Sarah Blackwood and her 3 children. Elijah's grave was separate, at the edge of the cemetery in the area reserved for suicides and other undesirable burials. Thomas arranged with the local pastor for a small memorial service to be held the following Sunday. The pastor was skeptical when Thomas explained the situation, but agreed nonetheless, perhaps seeing the determination in Thomas's eyes. When Sunday arrived, Thomas, Margaret, and Eleanor attended the service, along with the old nurse and a few curious townsfolk who had heard rumors of the haunted Blackwood house. The pastor spoke eloquent words about children returning to God's embrace, about forgiveness and eternal rest. As Margaret placed flowers on the 4 graves, she whispered, "It's time to go now, children. Find your mother in the light. Be at peace." That night, for the first time since moving into the house, no knocking came at midnight. The silence was both a relief and, strangely, a disappointment. "Do you think it worked?" Margaret whispered in the darkness. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I hope so." They slept peacefully until dawn, the house quiet around them, but the peace was short-lived. The following night, just after midnight, the knocking returned. Tap, tap, tap. Thomas opened their bedroom door without hesitation, now more curious than afraid. "I thought you had moved on," he said to the empty hallway. "We tried," came William's voice, sounding frustrated. "We went to the cemetery. We saw you there. We heard the pastor's words, but we still can't leave." "What's keeping you here?" Margaret asked, joining Thomas at the door. "We don't know," Mary wailed. Thomas and Margaret spent the next week trying to understand what kept the Blackwood children tethered to the house. Each night, the invisible children would knock at their door, and each night the Petersons would invite them in, searching for answers. "Perhaps there's something in the house," Thomas suggested one evening as they prepared for the now familiar midnight visitation. "Something important to them that was left behind." "Like what?" Margaret asked, gently rocking Eleanor to sleep. "I don't know. A toy, perhaps, or something their mother gave them." That night, when the children appeared, Thomas asked them directly, "Is there something in this house that belongs to you? Something special that you're looking for?" The children were silent for so long that Thomas thought they might have departed without answering. Finally, William spoke, his voice barely audible even in the quiet kitchen. "Father took our things away after we died. He couldn't bear to see them. He put them in the cellar," James added, "in a trunk with Mother's wedding dress." Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. They had explored most of the house upon moving in, but the cellar door had been locked, and Thomas had assumed it was merely for storage. He had planned to break the lock eventually, but hadn't gotten around to it yet. "There's a cellar?" Thomas asked, suddenly alert. "Under the kitchen," Mary's voice came from near the stove. "Behind the door Father always kept locked." Thomas stood immediately, moving to the small door in the corner of the kitchen that they had assumed was a pantry. It was indeed locked, with a heavy iron padlock that looked newer than the rest of the house's fixtures. "I'll get my tools," he said, determination in his voice. It took nearly an hour of work with a saw and hammer to break through the lock. When the door finally swung open, a rush of stale, cold air emerged from the darkness below. Thomas lit a lantern and descended the narrow stairs, Margaret following cautiously behind. The cellar was small and damp, with earthen walls and a packed dirt floor. In one corner stood a large wooden trunk, secured with yet another lock. "That's it," William's voice came from behind them on the stairs. "That's where our things are." This lock was easier to break than the doors had been. When Thomas finally lifted the trunk's heavy lid, both he and Margaret gasped at the contents. On top lay a woman's wedding dress, yellowed with age but still beautiful, with delicate lace and pearl buttons. Beneath it were children's clothes neatly folded, dresses for Mary, small suits for the boys. And at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped carefully in cloth, were the children's treasures. Wooden toys, a child's Bible with William's name inscribed inside the cover, a collection of polished stones that must have belonged to James, and a porcelain doll with a cracked face that had clearly been Mary's prized possession. "My doll!" Mary's voice cried out with excitement. "Father fixed her face after I dropped her." Thomas carefully lifted the doll from the trunk. Though he still couldn't see Mary, he held the doll out toward where her voice had come from. "Is this what you've been looking for all this time?" The doll seemed to hover for a moment as invisible hands took it from him. "I missed her," Mary said simply. Margaret reached into the trunk and withdrew the Bible. "William, is this yours?" "Father read to us from it every night," William's voice confirmed. "Even when we were sick." One by one, Thomas and Margaret removed the items from the trunk, returning them to their owners. With each reunion, the air in the cellar seemed to grow lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting incrementally. When all the treasures had been distributed, Thomas closed the trunk, leaving only Sarah Blackwood's wedding dress inside. "Shall we bring these upstairs?" he suggested. That night, they arranged the children's belongings on the kitchen table. Though they couldn't see the Blackwood children clearly, they occasionally caught glimpses, a shimmer here, a distortion there, as the ghostly hands touched and held the long-lost treasures. "Why did Father hide our things?" James asked, his voice sad. "I think they reminded him too much of what he had lost," Margaret answered gently. "Sometimes, when people are grieving, they try to hide away the things that hurt them to see." "Like he hid us in the cemetery?" Mary asked. The innocent question broke Margaret's heart. "No, dear. You were buried properly with love. Your father was just too sad to keep your toys where he could see them every day." As the night wore on, the children shared memories prompted by their recovered possessions. William's pride when his father had first deemed him old enough for his own Bible, James's adventures collecting his special stones from the creek behind the house, Mary's tea parties with her doll and her mother. For the first time, Thomas and Margaret felt they were truly seeing the Blackwood family as they had been in life. Not as tragic victims or frightening apparitions, but as a loving family whose happiness had been shattered by illness and death. As dawn approached, William's voice, now coming from near the window, grew serious. "There's light coming," he said, wonder in his voice. "Not the sun, a different light." "We can see Mother," James added, his voice moving toward the window as well. "She's in the light, calling us." Thomas and Margaret stood, instinctively moving closer together. "Can you go to her now?" Thomas asked. "I think," Mary's voice hesitated, "I think we can, now that we have our things." "Will you take them with you?" Margaret asked, gesturing to the toys and treasures on the table. A small laugh came from Mary. "We don't need them there, but thank you for finding them. It helps us remember who we are." Will you come back?" Thomas asked, surprised to find himself hoping the answer might be yes. There was a pause before William responded. "Not like this, but sometimes you might feel us, if that's all right." "Of course it's all right," Margaret said, tears welling in her eyes. "This is your home too." "Goodbye, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," William said formally. "Thank you for listening to us." "Goodbye, Eleanor," Mary added. "Grow up happy." And then they were gone. Not with any dramatic flourish or supernatural display, they simply weren't there anymore. The air in the kitchen returned to normal temperature, the peculiar sense of being watched vanished, and Thomas and Margaret were left standing alone with the Blackwood children's possessions spread out on the table before them. The Peterson family remained in the Amarillo farmhouse for 5 more years. During that time, they never again heard knocking at midnight or children's laughter in empty rooms. The house felt different, peaceful, even welcoming at times. Occasionally, on quiet evenings, Margaret would feel a gentle touch on her hand while sewing, or Thomas would sense a presence beside him as he read the newspaper. But these moments were comforting rather than frightening. Eleanor grew from an infant to a lively child, seemingly unaware of the house's history. They never told her about the Blackwood children, though sometimes she would stop in the middle of play, cock her head as if listening to someone, then smile and continue with her games. They kept the Blackwood children's possessions, displayed on a small shelf in the living room as a memorial and a reminder. When visitors asked about the peculiar collection, Thomas and Margaret would simply say they belonged to children who had once lived in the house. The old nurse from town visited occasionally, pleased to see the changes in the house and in the Peterson family. "You did a good thing," she told Thomas once as they watched Eleanor playing in the yard. "Those children needed someone to remember them, to care about what happened to them." "We didn't do much," Thomas demurred, "just listened to them and found their belongings." "Sometimes that's all anyone needs," the nurse replied, "living or dead." In the summer of 1908, a drought worse than any in living memory struck the Texas Panhandle. Crops failed, livestock died, and many families were forced to abandon their farms. The Petersons held out longer than most, but eventually Thomas had to acknowledge defeat. "We'll go back east," he told Margaret one evening after Eleanor had gone to bed. "My brother in Ohio says he can help me find work in the factory there." Margaret nodded, resigned, but not surprised. They had fought the drought with everything they had, but some battles couldn't be won. As they packed their belongings for the journey, Margaret paused over the Blackwood children's treasures. "Should we take these?" she asked. Thomas considered the question seriously. "No," he finally decided. "They belong to this house, to this land. We should leave them here." But the night before their departure, Thomas and Margaret sat at the kitchen table, reminiscing about their years in the house, the hardships and joys, the strange beginning and the peaceful, if premature, ending. "I wonder what will happen to the house now," Margaret mused, "if it will stand empty again, waiting for another family. "The bank will sell it eventually," Thomas said, "and maybe the next family will be luckier with the land than we were." "Do you think the children will come back once we're gone?" Thomas shook his head. "No, I think they've truly moved on, but their memory remains here. And I think that's important." In the morning, as they loaded the last of their possessions into their wagon, Thomas made a decision. Taking a piece of paper from his pocket, he wrote a brief note explaining the history of the house and the fate of the Blackwood family. He included the story of the ghostly children and how they had finally found peace. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked as he folded the paper and tucked it into the family Bible they were leaving behind on the shelf with the children's belongings. "Leaving a message for whoever comes next," Thomas explained, "so they'll understand if they ever hear knocking at midnight." "You think they might come back?" "I doubt it," Thomas said, "but the next family should know they have nothing to fear, that this house has seen both tragedy and healing." As they pulled away from the farmhouse for the last time, Eleanor, now 6 years old, waved goodbye from her seat in the wagon. "Mama," she said, turning to Margaret with the innocent certainty of childhood, "the children in the house say they'll miss us." Margaret and Thomas exchanged startled glances. "What children, Ellie?" Thomas asked carefully. Eleanor shrugged. "The ones I play with sometimes. They said they're happy now, but they'll miss us. They said not to worry, though. They'll watch over the house until the next family comes." Thomas looked back at the house, standing solid against the harsh landscape, despite the years of neglect and hardship it had witnessed. For a moment he thought he saw 3 small figures on the porch, 2 boys and a girl, waving goodbye. Then the sun shifted, and there was nothing but the play of light and shadow on the weathered wood. "Yes," he said, turning back to the road ahead. "I believe they will." Years later, long after the Petersons had settled in Ohio, the Amarillo Gazette would publish a small article about the old Blackwood Peterson house, noting that despite its tragic history, subsequent families reported no strange occurrences. The house, it seemed, was finally at peace, its ghostly inhabitants having found their way to whatever light awaited them beyond this world. But local children still whispered stories about the house on the prairie, where, if you were very quiet and very kind, You might sometimes hear the laughter of invisible children or feel the gentle touch of a small hand seeking friendship. And occasionally, on mild summer evenings when the Texas moon hung low in the sky, passers-by would swear they could see three small figures playing in the yard, two boys and a girl, who would vanish like morning mist if approached. The Peterson Case, as it came to be known in local legend, became a story not of horror, but of healing. A reminder that sometimes what haunts us is not malevolence, but memory, and that even the dead may find peace if the living are willing to listen.